Ibu Mari and have a deep respect for her expertise and the contribution she has made to a full range of global economic trade and issues such as we're dealing with today. So we're delighted to have Mari Pangestu here with us on the panel today. And then we have from the University of Western Australia, the director of the University of Western Australia Institute of Agriculture, and somebody who has 30 years in the field as a deep dive expert, helping us to understand the issues. So what I'd like to start out with, if I could turn to the PowerPoint presentation itself, I just want to go through a couple of the slides, and given our short time, I'm only going to highlight a few of them. We put together, and you all have copies of this in front of you, some of the core challenges in food security. And again, many of these were addressed by Dr. Yudhoyono in his address. But I want to just highlight a couple of things. First, if you notice, the estimate is that in 35 years, there will be 735 million more people in Asia. And that means that the amount of Asian food consumption is expected to double by 2050. And so this begins to set the context for the challenges that we faced. The food prices also is something that have been addressed by Dr. Yudhoyono, hitting a high in 2012 with the economic downturn coming down a little bit. But just to give you a better sense of consumption, in 2027, this is a graphic representation of consumption. And if you look at 2050, it gives you a sense of the per capita consumption of food going up. But the problem is actually more complex than just increasing consumption. It's also a question of changing consumption. Because as the average citizen in Asia moves up into the middle class, their consumption patterns change dramatically. And this chart just gives you a sense for the tremendous amount of expansion that we anticipate to see in middle class consumption across the board, not just on food. Now, to help represent this graphically, this is a graphic representation of middle-class citizens in Asia in 2009. This is a representation of middle-class citizens in Asia, or in the zone, if you will, in 2050, or 2030, actually, not even the foot. So it gives you a sense of this dramatic expansion. The reason we point this out is because when people move to the middle class, there's also a dramatic expansion in the type of foods they consume. Whether they be dairy or meat or even grains. And so the purpose of this panel and the underlying assumption of this panel is that the status quo is not sufficient. Business as usual in agricultural production is not sufficient, because on top of these charts that I have laid out and the rest of this book, which I will ask you to refer to in greater detail later, even before you assume challenges of climate change, which Dr. Yudhoyono addressed, even before you assume difficulties with water, overall economic projects, even if you assume that the current conditions can just persist and it doesn't get worse, business as usual cannot feed the population of the future. And so what the case we're making is that there needs to be a fundamental change involving international cooperation, innovation, and investment. So what I'd like to do right now is kind of move beyond that and kind of begin a discussion with our panelists here, thinking of food security beyond just a national basis, but thinking about food security in the zone, in the region. And first I'd like to turn to Dr. Pangestu, just kind of her initial observations as to the challenge you see for the region going forward. Dr. Pangestu.
Yeah, thank you. I will talk about the region, but I think I will take somewhat of an Indonesian perspective. And as everybody was talking today, I had this vivid memory of what I went through as trade minister in 2008 when the food prices went up by 100%. Okay, and we forgot about that. We had this intense discussion for 2 years, nationally, regionally, globally, on this food prices going up. What should we do? And a lot of analysis as to why that happened. And I just want to remind everybody of why it happened. A lot of the issues were already explained. When we try to understand why did the food prices go up by 100% in 2008, part of it was a reduced investment in production and innovation and technology. And the reason was because prices were depressed. And the prices were depressed because of distorting agriculture trade policies. Okay, this is coming, I'm going to say a few things that's kind of trade related, but it leads to the issue of the incentive system the price and the fair and free trade system that President was just talking about earlier is very important in the way you're going to push production, technology, investment, and so on. And the fact that the other reason why the food price went up by 100%, if you recall, countries started, because they were so worried about feeding their population, they restricted exports. Okay, remember Russia restricted wheat, and a number of our ASEAN neighbors tried to restrict rice exports. So I'm just reminding everybody that was a lesson learned that we should be reminded of. Yeah, and remember also the fuel and food debate then. A lot of food was being used as feedstock for biofuel because countries, regions like Europe were giving incentives for biofuel. Okay, so incentives, prices, markets do matter. And what should we be doing about it? And what we forgot, we started doing it, and then we forgot to continue doing it. The trading system, distorting prices in agriculture caused by export subsidies, domestic support, which should have been addressed in the WTO Doha negotiations. We stopped because we have problems with completing the negotiations. I think you can only remove the distorting trade policies of Europe and the US and other developed countries only through a multilateral system. You can't do it bilaterally. It won't happen in the bilateral agreements. So I still think that's a priority out there somewhere. Second, I think nations are getting lost again on this whole issue of food self-sufficiency and food security. Getting a little bit nationalist again. Food self-sufficiency at the moment in some parts of, I won't say where, but in some parts of our part of the world, food self-sufficiency equals to no imports. And that's really dangerous because food self-sufficiency, I think Pak Hermanto had it right, food self-sufficiency and food security is about improving the welfare of farmers and consumers. Okay, so it's about availability, affordability, and accessibility. This was the lesson we learned. I'm the one who has on the front line having to stabilize the price of rice and so on, right? If you cannot have a sensible policy on food self-sufficiency, then you're going to get all the other things wrong about what you need to do for production, what you need to do for the supporting price for the farmers and the consumers. You know, during 2008, we had this huge debate. When you have high prices or low prices, what's the role of government? How should government intervene? Depress prices, push prices down when it's 100% going up? The answer as an economist is no, because high prices means you have shortage of supply. So the supply response will happen if you have high prices, right? But of course, consumers are suffering. So you should be giving cash to the consumers to buy the higher price, and then eventually the supply response will happen. So the intervention that governments make also is important in how you're going to have the incentive system for production to happen, for investment to happen, for in terms of technology, what you need to do to improve yield and productivity and so on. I think the final point I would like to make, because a number of people mentioned about nutrition, you know, we tend to, when we talk about food security, food self-sufficiency, we tend to focus on staples, but I think the aspect of nutrition is so important, and all the numbers for Indonesia is not looking good. We have stunting problem, we have high prevalence of stunting, and that's not just about shorter heights, but of course, the mental development, and that's your human capital, your human capacity. And that's another set of issues about how you're going to grow the right kind of food using less water because of the environment, and using less water, using less land, and so on. And here is where I just make 2 points on that. One is the intervention, again, what's the cooperation? What should nations do? What should be the regional and global cooperation? I think I liked one of your questions, Dino. Can we eliminate extreme poverty? Yeah? Can we eliminate extreme hunger? You know, the answer is yes. In fact, if you look at the technology available and the food waste available, but there's no cooperation. If developing countries could actually get the technology, you know, at zero price or at a low cost to be able to increase the yield, if there could be a second green revolution that could be shared, then you could actually address a lot of the food issues, including for nutrition purposes. And nutrition is very important, especially in the early years of childhood. Yeah, and that's, again, in Indonesia, I think, another issue that we should be focused on. And just as an anecdote, you are talking about Indonesia-Australia relations. I think I have pretty good human capital, and the reason is because I grew up in Australia. Part of my younger years was in Australia, and I'm a recipient of 1/3 of a pint of milk every day in primary school for like a number of years. And that explains my good health, and that's just to reinforce the point about the importance of nutrition at an early stage. Maybe I'll stop there. There are some other issues that I'd like to pick up on later about the importance of a comprehensive approach, not just the production of agriculture, but all the supporting system that needs to go with it.
Thank you so much, Ibu Mari. In our discussions in creating this conference, we very carefully avoided the term food security in the title because, as you mentioned, so often that devolves into an anti-import kind of mentality, when one of the fundamental assumptions behind this is that the zone needs to work together to solve shared problems. And so your macro perspective, putting this in the context of trade and the economy, is extremely helpful. So thanks so much. We're also very fortunate to have someone who can kind of look at into a little bit more of a deep dive from an agronomist perspective or some of the agriculture perspective. So I'd like to turn to Sadiq for initial comments. And I think we have our PowerPoint presentation.
Thank you, Gordon. I'll use four slides only. Some of these things has already been mentioned. So if I can have the first slide. How is that? So basically, we have heard that the population has really gone. We're talking about 9.7 billion precisely. I think the point I want to mention is here, it's not about the population impact, the population multiplied by the affluence, by the technology. I think this makes a big statement here. So if 30 years ago I stood here and talked, people say India, China, Indonesia, they won't be able to afford. I think people are wrong. So the population-rich countries, there's a lot of potential. We're talking about the middle class, etc. So yes, the population has got an impact on the environment, but also they generate the affluence. And don't underestimate the technology. So over the last 10,000 years, we have seen the population moving from 2 to 20 million to 7.3 billion. So population is an asset. By educating the people, especially the mothers and the children, we can have a management of population. The next one is really the impact. I think the main thing Dr. Yudiano did address about the ecosystem interaction. That is the environment. That is going to be the biggest challenge I see. I'll just run through a couple of points here very quickly. That is this is the wind and water erosion. Huge amount of soil is lost. And last year it was the International Year of the Soil. I won't go through the numbers there. The next one is the salinity here, including in Australia, the dryland salinity as well as the irrigation salinity. A lot of agriculture in this part, particularly Asia, is irrigated. The third one is the algal blooms, the amount of pesticides and fertilizers flowing into the system. So we need to look after that. We just can't have a green revolution. We want to have a green revolution, evergreen revolution, looking after the environment. The next point is the urbanization. Dr. Yudiano did mention that we have 1.4 billion hectares of land, but in fact that is declining every day at the rate because of the urbanization, including in Indonesia, significant of agricultural land is lost. So the government has to bring a policy how to avoid that. The next one is the biodiversity. This is another important thing, not only in this region, but also in Australia. The biodiversity is lost at a rapid rate, significant, about 10,000 species per year. Previously, we used to lose only 5 species. The next important thing is, again, in this part of the world, the tropical rainforest is being destroyed for various reasons, and that we need to look at that. And finally, the water, which is the critical thing. Enormous amount of water is used for agriculture. How can we then manage those water conservation strategies? And finally, the carbon. We talk about the carbon loss in the soil. That is an important aspect. We need to retain that carbon. Soil is the most important aspect. So how do we going to meet the food demand in 2050? I think we can feed the world today up to 10 billion people. We heard from reducing the waste, both within the farm and the forced farm gate. Increasing access to food by addressing poverty, inequality, wars, and political instability. Improving distribution. It's not about producing more, especially in a country like Indonesia, 6,000, 7,000 islands. How do you connect them? How do we get the food from one place to the other? Increasing pulses. This is the International Year of the Pulses. This is the legumes, and that can have a plant-based diet. We don't need to depend upon animal diet. This can make a huge difference. Accepting general responsibility for not taking things granted. We heard that. That is the agronomic intervention, biological nitrogen fixation, and don't destroy more land. That is called the sustainable intensification. No additional apportion of land and water to agriculture. So the take-home message is we must produce enough nourishing to feed the 9 to 7 billion people by 2050 while remaining within the planetary boundaries. We must manage volatility. We heard from my colleague here, the price, and reduce the vulnerability, including the climate change. 80% of the hungry people living in rural areas, and that's about 570 million small farmers. They produce 80% of the world food, including 36 million, 35 million in Indonesia. How can we empower the small farmers? Without that, we will not be able to produce more food. Of course, we have seen the number of hungry has dropped, but the malnutrition, hidden hunger, these are the important issues. So the two places we need to focus, Sub-Saharan Africa, and in this context, Southern Asia. That is where we haven't made the progress in relation to nutritional security. So we just heard from my colleague here, pathways to reduce hunger, malnutrition, poverty is not merely about agriculture-led strategies. Social protection, we heard, how can we intervene that? And finally, the targeted nutrition strategy, including the primary schools, because some of our children, both in this country and in the region, is malnourished. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. We're a little bit, thank you, appreciate it. If you combine the remarks by Dr. Yudhoyono and what we've heard from our two panelists today and the publication we put out, what we're hoping you take away from this, particularly the younger students who are in the audience here today, is the title of this panel. We called it a call to action or a case to action. We hope you understand is that if you look at economic trends and demographic trends and consumption trends, and then you add on to that those rather concerning trends that are going the other direction that have been laid out and put that in the context of economics, that something must be done differently. We cannot keep doing it the way we have been doing it in the past, because particularly in this region, there are real challenges. And our hope is that those solutions are also in the zone, whether it is through international cooperation, whether it is through innovation, whether it is through investment, or all three together. So we don't have much more time, but I'd like to take just a few more minutes to go to our two panelists. If you look at the students out in this generation who most of us probably won't be too active in 2050. They will be active in 2050. What are the takeaways that you think that they need to focus on and understand best to understand the challenges in the zone? So we'll start with you, Mari.
Yeah, the challenges are that no country, we are integrated. We are going to become more integrated, more interdependent. And technology is going to even make us more closely linked together. So our fates are bound together. So if you take something like cooperation in food, when we had that rice issue, we are all rice eaters. Some of us are importers, some of us are exporters. The moment somebody decides to limit the export, then the price goes up, right? And so what happened was we had to get together and sit together and say, okay, this cannot happen. So we ended up saying, okay, we cannot go around having very strange restrictive policies. We, in fact, cooperated and created rice reserves as a result. So I think dialogue, communication, finding the needs of each other and how you can complement each other. And I think sharing of technology is going to be a big issue out there. And we would hope that developed countries would also be able to share the technologies. I think climate change is a very scary issue out there, and we're already suffering from it. I think I was told a few days ago that the price of rice is going up at the moment in Indonesia, and that kind of shocked me because we are in the middle of harvest. Never happened, you know. Usually harvest, price goes down. So the explanation is partly El Nino, partly all the harvest. There's no main harvest season anymore because of climate change. So I think these are really scary issues that the young people should not be scared, but they should be, okay, a problem is, challenges and problems are scary, but even more important is finding the solution. So finding the solution through technology, through getting knowledge. And you know, that we always have this fear that, I think SBY mentioned it, people are leaving agriculture and working in other sectors. No, this agriculture is not the kind of the employment of last resort. It should be a part of our future. And agriculture is not about just farming and production. It's all the the technology that goes into the production, the post-harvest, and most importantly, the whole food chain, the whole value chain. That's distribution, that's services, that's the cold storage. When I was trade minister, we did a study looking at fruits and horticulture. By the time they get to the market, how much wastage, how much loss there was? It was 60%. I was so shocked. And it's because of the bad roads, no cold storage, and so on. So that's actually a lot of knowledge and opportunity, I would say, for all our young people to contribute so that we can really achieve not just, we can feed our people good, and not just staples, but also the nutrition that's needed. And the young people should really focus on how the importance of food nutrition for the human capital and that's the future of our country and of our region.
Thank you. Sadiq?
Well,
It's okay.
I'll be very brief here. I think the young people there, they need to embrace science and technology as much as possible. There are 10 global challenges. Embrace one of those challenges, all related to food and nutritional security, energy, the climate change. How can you do your context-based studies, even if you do an essay in your assignment? Why don't you do that in relation to Indonesia? And then bring those things, because you are the bright minds, you are the future for this country and for the globe. So investment in science and technology, the classroom context-based type of analysis in relation to Indonesia, take up some of the challenges because there are plenty of opportunities. And the science is moving so fast. Don't be scared. Get into it and try, go overseas and do your studies, come back and work for this country. And I'm sure that Indonesia will go into heights with that.
One of the underlying assumptions behind the in-the-zone model of a conference is the issues such as we have discussed today are better addressed collectively. And if you include, the top 100 universities and kind of the expertise that exists in Western Australia, all the way up through Indonesia, the rest of ASEAN, up into Tokyo, that problems which seem very big, and I have to confess, after Dr. Yudhoyono's speech and after what we discussed today, these are big problems. And big problems require big thinking and big cooperation in terms of solving them. We could go on for a long time, and I'm hesitant to cut short our panelists, but we want to get a little bit back towards the schedule. I want to make sure that we give time for a coffee break and for the next keynote speaker. Please join me in thanking our two initial panelists for their helping us set the stage for the rest of the discussion today. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you very much to our panelists. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now take a break for morning tea. If you're after some refreshments, there's coffee being sold in the foyer or some restaurants and cafes in the area. To our speakers who are present and to Ambassador Grigson, I'd ask if you could just hang around for a second while we get the stage ready for a group photograph. And we hope to see you very promptly at around 11:05. Thank you very much.
Ya, bisa.
If we could ask, no, we're not there. If we could ask all of the speakers on the panels over the course of the day, including Dr. Udino, to come up on the stage for a group photograph for the speakers themselves, please. Thank you.
$2.2 billion Australian, with Indonesia the top market, valued at $1.07 billion of exports. This represented about 14% of Western Australia's total agri-food exports, valued at $7